She should not have been standing at that door on Christmas Eve, but she was, and everything that followed would quietly rewrite 2 lives forever. The snow fell in slow, patient sheets over Manhattan that night, turning the city into something almost silent despite the distant hum of traffic and glowing lights of December. At the top of a long private driveway in the Upper East Side, a massive black iron gate opened automatically as a car pulled in, revealing the home of William Carter, a billionaire known for deals that moved markets and a life that rarely paused for anything or anyone. Inside the mansion, warmth spilled through tall windows, golden light flickering against polished marble floors. A Christmas tree standing in the corner decorated with perfect symmetry and expensive ornaments that reflected a kind of quiet loneliness more than celebration. William stood near the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of water he had not yet touched, his expression distant, as if he were already thinking about tomorrow's meetings instead of the night around him. Then came the sound, soft at first, almost mistaken for the wind, a knock at the front door that did not belong to this world of quiet wealth and controlled silence. The sound came again, firmer this time, followed by a pause that felt heavier than it should have, and then a third knock that made William finally turn his head slightly, irritated by the interruption. He did not expect anyone tonight, especially not in weather like this, especially not someone who would come without warning to a door like his. The security system should have stopped this, he thought, already walking forward with slow, controlled steps, each one echoing faintly through the hallway. When he opened the door, the cold rushed in like a living thing, brushing against the warmth of the house and immediately changing the atmosphere. Standing there was a little black girl, no more than 7 years old, her small frame wrapped in a coat that was too thin for the freezing air, her cheeks red from the cold, her breath visible in quick, uneven clouds. Snow clung to her hair and eyelashes, and her eyes, wide and steady, carried something far older than her age. William's first instinct was confusion, quickly followed by concern, and then something he could not yet name. The girl did not speak right away, only looked up at him, as if gathering courage from somewhere deep inside herself. Behind her, the driveway stretched empty and dark. No adult, no car, no sign of where she had come from or how long she had been standing there. Finally, she spoke in a voice small but clear enough to cut through the wind. "Are you Mr. Carter?" she asked, her words careful, as if she had practiced them in her mind many times before arriving here. William hesitated, his expression tightening slightly, not from anger, but from uncertainty. "Yes," he said slowly, studying her face, searching for context that was not there. The girl nodded once, as if confirming something important, then tightened her grip on the strap of a small worn backpack resting against her shoulder. "My name is Ava," she said, pausing just long enough for the cold to fill the silence again. "And I'm sorry for coming like this, but I didn't know where else to go." Something in the way she said it made William stop completely, the irritation fading into something heavier, more human. He noticed then how still she was trying to be despite shivering, how she kept her chin slightly raised as if refusing to let the cold or fear define her. He stepped slightly aside, not yet inviting her in, but no longer closing the space between them. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice lower now, more careful than before. Ava looked down for the first time, just for a second, then back up at him. "My mom is in the hospital," she said, "and they said we couldn't stay anymore where we were." The words were simple, but they landed in the quiet space between them with a weight that made the entire house, behind William, feel suddenly distant. From inside, the warmth of the Christmas tree lights flickered softly, but neither of them moved toward it yet. William glanced past her again, scanning the empty street, the untouched snow, the absence of any adult presence, and for reasons he could not immediately explain, he did not close the door. Instead, he asked the question that would begin to shift everything, even though he did not yet know it. "How did you find this place?" Ava hesitated, then reached carefully into her small backpack, pulling out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, as if it had been held onto for a very long time. She did not explain it yet, just held it out toward him with both hands, as if it carried everything she could not put into words. William looked at the paper, then back at her face, and in that moment, the noise of his world seemed to narrow into something very small and very still, as if Christmas itself had paused outside his door, waiting for him to decide whether to let it in or turn it away. William Carter stood in the open doorway, the cold air pressing against the warmth of the mansion behind him, like an unwelcome reminder that the world outside his walls did not follow his rules. The small piece of paper in his hand felt heavier than it should have, its edges softened from being folded and unfolded too many times. Ava remained still where she stood on the stone steps, her small hands tucked close to her body, as if trying to conserve every bit of warmth she had left. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them felt wider than the driveway itself. Inside the house, the soft glow of Christmas lights continued to shimmer against polished surfaces, but William no longer seemed fully aware of it. He glanced down at the paper again, noticing a faint handwritten address and a name beneath it that made something subtle shift in his expression, though he did not show it fully. Ava watched him carefully, reading his silence in a way that children often do when they have learned to expect uncertainty from adults. Finally, William stepped back slightly and opened the door wider, not yet inviting her in, but no longer leaving her completely outside. "Where exactly is your mother?" he asked, his voice measured, controlled, but less distant than before. Ava swallowed, her breath trembling slightly in the cold before she answered. "At St. Mary's Hospital," she said. "They took her there yesterday, but they said she could not stay unless we had insurance or payment." Her words were simple, but they carried the kind of weight that did not belong in a child's voice. William's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of the hospital, not from anger, but from a recognition of systems and decisions he had indirectly influenced in ways he rarely confronted directly. He looked away for a brief moment, toward the glowing tree inside the house, then back at her. "And where were you before you came here?" he asked. Ava hesitated again, then tightened her grip on her backpack strap. "We were staying in a shelter, but they said it was full tonight," she replied, her voice steady despite the cold. "I remembered the address from a paper my mom kept. She said if anything ever went wrong, I should find you." That sentence landed differently than the others, heavier in a way William could not immediately categorize. He studied her face more closely now, noticing not just the cold, but the determination beneath it, the way she refused to break eye contact even as her body shivered. Behind him, from deeper inside the mansion, a faint sound of footsteps approached, and a moment later, a man in a dark suit appeared near the hallway entrance. It was Edward Hayes, William's assistant, who had clearly been alerted to the unexpected visitor. Edward's eyes moved quickly from Ava to William, then lowered slightly as he spoke in a cautious tone. "Sir, should I contact security or arrange for someone to assist her elsewhere?" he asked carefully, already assuming this was a situation to be managed rather than understood. William did not answer immediately. Instead, he kept his attention on Ava, who had now lowered her gaze slightly, as if bracing for the familiar outcome of being dismissed. The quiet tension in the doorway deepened, broken only by the distant sound of a clock inside marking the passing seconds. William finally spoke, not to Edward, but to Ava. "Why me?" he asked simply. Ava looked up again, and for the first time her voice carried a slight crack of emotion. "Because my mom said you helped people before," she said, "and because she said you would remember her if I ever said her name." William felt a subtle tightening in his chest at that, though he did not yet let it show fully. He glanced again at the paper, then at the snow falling gently around them, as if the entire night was waiting for his decision. Edward shifted slightly behind him, still waiting for instruction, but William raised one hand slightly, signaling silence. For a moment, the billionaire who controlled companies and decisions that moved across cities and countries stood completely still in front of a child who had nothing but a folded paper and a memory. Then, slowly, William stepped aside, fully opening the door at last. "Come inside," he said quietly, his voice no longer sharp or distant, but carrying something uncertain and unfamiliar, as if even he did not fully understand why he had said it. Ava hesitated for only a second before stepping forward, crossing the threshold from the cold into the warm light of the mansion. As she entered, snow melted softly from her coat onto the marble floor, leaving small dark marks that quickly faded into nothing. William watched her for a moment longer than necessary, then closed the door behind her, and in doing so, unknowingly crossed a line that would change far more than just that night. The moment the door closed behind Ava, the warmth of the mansion wrapped around her like another world entirely, almost too quiet compared to the storm she had just walked through. William Carter stood still for a brief second longer than necessary, his hand still resting near the door handle, as if uncertain whether he had made the right decision. The soft glow of the Christmas lights reflected across the polished marble floor, and for the first time that evening, Ava looked around her slowly, taking in the scale of the home she had just entered. It was not just large, it was distant, as if every piece of furniture had been placed for display rather than for living. Edward Hayes, still standing a few steps behind William, cleared his throat gently. "Sir, should I prepare a guest room or arrange for temporary accommodation elsewhere?" he asked in a careful tone, already trying to categorize the situation into something manageable. William did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes remained on Ava, who stood quietly near the entrance, her small shoes leaving faint wet marks on the marble that quickly began to fade. "It is fine for now," William said at last, his voice measured but no longer firm. "She can stay here tonight." Edward hesitated, as if considering whether to question the decision, but ultimately gave a small nod and stepped away, leaving the two of them alone in the large entry hall. Ava shifted slightly, holding her backpack closer, unsure of where she was supposed to stand or what she was allowed to touch. William noticed this and motioned gently toward the living room. "You can sit there," he said, pointing toward a large sofa near the fireplace. Ava obeyed quietly, climbing onto the edge of the seat as if afraid to take up too much space. The fire crackled softly, casting moving shadows across the room, and for a moment, neither of them spoke again. William walked toward the window, looking out at the snow that continued to fall over the city, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. Ava watched him carefully, her eyes following his movements, sensing that something inside him was shifting even if she did not understand what it was. After a long pause, William turned slightly. "You said your mother is at St. Mary's Hospital," he said, his tone more reflective now. Ava nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. They said she was very tired and needed help, but we could not stay because we did not have enough for the bill." William lowered his gaze slightly, as if processing more than just the words she had spoken. He had heard similar situations described in reports, meetings, and briefings, but hearing it in the voice of a child made it feel different, less abstract, more immediate. He walked slowly toward the fireplace and stood near it, his expression unreadable for a moment. "And your mother told you to come here," he said, not as a question, but as an attempt to understand. Ava nodded again, then reached carefully into her backpack once more. This time, she pulled out a small photograph, its edges worn and slightly bent. She held it out with both hands, waiting. William hesitated before taking it, and when he finally did, his eyes narrowed slightly as he studied it. The photograph showed a woman standing beside a younger version of Ava, both smiling faintly in a way that suggested a moment of stability that no longer existed. There was something familiar about the woman, something William could not immediately place, but the feeling of recognition was undeniable. He looked at the photo longer than expected, his expression slowly changing from curiosity to something quieter, more unsettled. Ava watched him carefully, almost holding her breath. "She said you would remember her," Ava said softly, breaking the silence. William did not respond right away. Instead, he turned the photograph slightly, studying it again as if searching for a connection that had been buried under years of distance and memory. Finally, he spoke, but his voice was lower now, less controlled. "What is your mother's name?" he asked. Ava answered immediately. "Her name is Clara Johnson." At that moment, something subtle shifted in William's expression, not dramatic, but deep enough to change the air in the room. He repeated the name quietly, almost to himself, as if testing whether it belonged to a memory he had not fully acknowledged in years. The fire crackled again, louder for a brief second, filling the silence that followed. Ava remained still, watching him carefully, unaware of the full weight of what she had just revealed, only sensing that something important was happening. William slowly lowered the photograph, his grip tightening slightly before he placed it on the table beside him. For the first time since she had arrived, he no longer looked at Ava as a stranger standing in his home, but as something far more complicated, something connected to a past he had not yet fully faced. Outside, the snow continued to fall steadily over the city, covering everything in a quiet white layer that seemed to soften even the most distant edges of memory. The silence in the room did not break immediately after William Carter repeated the name, as if the sound itself needed time to settle into the walls of the mansion. Clara Johnson. It lingered in the air like something unfinished, something that had been waiting for years to be spoken again. Ava sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching William carefully as he stood near the fireplace without moving. The photograph remained on the table beside him, slightly angled now, as if it had been placed there by accident, but was actually holding the center of everything in the room. Edward Hayes had returned quietly a few minutes earlier, standing near the entrance of the living room with a tablet in his hand, unsure whether to interrupt or wait for instruction. William finally turned away from the fire and spoke in a lower voice than before. "Edward, cancel my morning schedule," he said simply. Edward blinked, clearly surprised, but nodded immediately. "Yes, sir. All meetings." William paused briefly before answering. "All of them." Ava looked down at her hands when she heard that, not fully understanding the weight of it, but sensing that something important was shifting because of her presence. William walked slowly toward the table and picked up the photograph again, studying it with more focus this time. The woman in the image, Clara Johnson, was not just a name from memory anymore. She was becoming something more real, something tied directly to the child sitting in his living room. Ava spoke quietly, breaking the silence with caution. "My mom said you knew her a long time ago," she said. William did not look up immediately. "I knew someone by that name," he replied carefully, as if measuring each word before releasing it. Ava nodded slightly, relieved in a way she could not explain. "She said you were kind once," Ava added. That word, kind, seemed to land differently than the others. William looked up at her then, his expression unreadable, but no longer distant. There was a faint tension in his jaw, not from anger, but from something closer to reflection. "People change," he said quietly, almost to himself. Ava did not respond, but her small shoulders lowered slightly, as if she was trying to understand what that meant. The fire crackled again, casting shifting light across the room, and for a moment, the mansion felt less like a symbol of wealth and more like a space holding unresolved history. Edward stepped forward slightly, breaking his silence. "Sir, I was able to pull limited information from St. Mary's Hospital records system," he said carefully. William turned his head toward him immediately. "And?" he asked. Edward hesitated before continuing. "A Clara Johnson was admitted yesterday evening. Emergency intake. No listed emergency contact beyond a partial file note." William's expression tightened slightly, not in shock, but in recognition of something he had not wanted to confirm so quickly. Ava looked between them, sensing the seriousness even without understanding the details. William placed the photograph back down on the table, this time more deliberately, then walked a few steps away as if needing space to think. "Why was she not transferred to a private facility?" he asked. Edward lowered his gaze slightly. "It appears there was no approved coverage at the time of admission, sir." The answer hung in the air like a final piece of a puzzle falling into place. William's eyes drifted back toward Ava, who was still sitting quietly on the sofa, her small frame almost swallowed by the size of the room. For a brief moment, the distance between them felt less physical and more emotional, as if they were standing on opposite sides of something neither of them had fully named yet. William walked back slowly and stopped a few feet in front of her. "Ava," he said gently, testing her attention. She looked up immediately. "Yes, sir." He paused for a moment, then spoke with careful restraint. "Did your mother ever mention why she came back here now?" Ava shook her head slightly. "She only said if anything ever happened, I should find you before it was too late." The words were simple, but they created a silence that stretched deeper than before. William looked away briefly, his eyes falling toward the window where snow continued to drift past the glass, covering the city in a quiet white distance. When he turned back, his voice was softer. "You can stay here tonight," he said again, but this time it carried more intention, less uncertainty. Ava nodded quietly, as if she had been holding her breath since the moment she arrived and was only now allowed to release it. Edward stepped back slightly, already preparing arrangements in his mind, but William raised a hand gently, stopping him. "No need for formal arrangements yet," he said. "Just make sure she is warm and has something to eat." Edward nodded and left the room without further questions. When he was gone, the house felt even larger, but also strangely quieter, as if something had shifted inside it. Ava remained seated, but her posture had changed slightly, no longer as tense as before. William stood near the fireplace again, looking at the photograph one more time before placing it carefully into a drawer beside him, as if deciding not to let it sit in the open anymore, but also not letting it disappear. The firelight flickered across his face, and for the first time since Ava arrived, his expression was no longer that of a man interrupted by an inconvenience, but of someone standing at the edge of a memory he could no longer avoid. Outside, the snow continued to fall without pause, covering the world beyond the mansion in silence, while inside, something long buried had quietly begun to move again. The house was quieter after Edward Hayes left the room, leaving only the faint sound of the fire and the distant ticking of a clock somewhere deep in the mansion. Ava Johnson remained seated on the sofa, her small hands now resting more loosely in her lap, as if the tension in her body had slowly begun to ease. William Carter stood near the fireplace again, but this time he was not looking at the flames. His attention was divided between the silence of the room and the presence of the child who had disrupted it. For a long moment, he said nothing, and neither did she. It was the kind of silence that no longer felt empty, but instead carried something unspoken, something still forming. William finally spoke without turning fully toward her. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. Ava hesitated, then shook her head slightly. "Not since yesterday morning," she replied in a quiet voice, as if admitting it was not important enough to matter. William nodded once, then reached for a small intercom system on the side table and pressed a button. "Prepare." "Something light in the kitchen," he said calmly. There was a brief pause before a voice confirmed the request. Ava watched him carefully, noticing how effortlessly he gave instructions, as if the world simply adjusted itself around his words. Yet there was something different in how he moved now, less detached than before. After a moment, William walked toward the seating area and sat in a chair opposite her, maintaining a respectful distance. He studied her for a few seconds, not in a way that felt intrusive, but as if trying to understand a part of a story that had been missing for a long time. "Tell me about your mother," he said gently. Ava looked down at her hands again before speaking. "Her name is Clara Johnson," she began. "She works a lot, even when she is not feeling well. She always said she used to know you when she was younger, before things changed." William's expression shifted slightly at the words "before things changed," but he did not interrupt. Ava continued, her voice steady but soft. "She kept a small box with letters and an old photograph. She never let me open it, but last week she told me if anything happened, I should find you and give you the address." William leaned back slightly in his chair, absorbing her words without responding immediately. The firelight reflected faintly across his face, highlighting the subtle tension in his expression. "Did she say why she did not contact me herself?" he asked after a pause. Ava shook her head. "She said she tried once, a long time ago, but she never got a response." The room grew quiet again, and this time the silence felt heavier, filled with years that neither of them had lived through together but were now colliding in the present. William looked down briefly, then stood and walked slowly toward a cabinet near the wall. He opened a drawer and took out a thin folder, placing it on the table between them. Ava watched curiously but did not move. William opened the folder and scanned through a few pages before stopping on something that made him pause longer than before. It was a record, old but preserved, with a name that matched what Ava had said. "Clara Johnson." He closed the folder gently, then looked back at Ava. "I remember now," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Ava looked up, her eyes widening slightly, but she did not speak. William stood still for a moment, then walked toward the window again, looking out at the city covered in snow. "A long time ago," he said, his voice lower, "there were decisions made that separated people who should not have been separated." He did not elaborate further, but the weight in his tone made the meaning clear enough. Ava remained silent, absorbing his words without fully understanding all of them. After a moment, William turned back toward her. "Your mother is important to this story," he said carefully. "More than you may realize." Ava nodded slightly, though uncertainty remained in her expression. At that moment, a staff member quietly entered the room carrying a tray with simple food prepared quickly from the kitchen. William gestured for it to be placed on the table near Ava. "Eat," he said softly. Ava hesitated, then slowly moved closer and began to take small bites, her movements cautious but calmer than before. William watched her for a moment, then turned away slightly, as if needing space to process what was unfolding. The mansion, once defined by order and distance, now held something unfamiliar within it, a connection that neither wealth nor silence could fully contain. Outside, the snowfall continued without interruption, covering the city in a soft, unbroken layer, while inside, the past that had been buried for years was quietly beginning to surface again, piece by piece, in ways that could no longer be ignored. The night had settled deeper over the city, and the snowfall outside the mansion had thickened into a quiet curtain of white that softened every distant sound. Inside William Carter's home, the atmosphere had shifted in ways that were subtle but undeniable. Ava Johnson sat at the edge of the dining table, her small hands wrapped around a warm cup of milk, her movements slower now, as if the first real meal in a long time was beginning to bring her back to herself. William stood near the window again, but this time he was not watching the snow. His attention was on the reflection of the room behind him, on the small child seated at his table, and on the presence of something unresolved that had quietly entered his life without permission. The silence between them was no longer empty. It felt like it was holding questions neither of them had fully learned how to ask. After a long moment, William turned slightly. "Ava," he said gently. She looked up immediately, still holding the cup carefully with both hands. "Yes, sir," she answered. William paused, choosing his words with unusual care. "Do you remember anything else your mother said about me?" Ava thought for a moment, her eyes lowering slightly as she tried to recall. "She said you were very busy," she replied slowly, "but that you were not a bad person. She said you just stopped listening for a while." The words were simple, but they landed in the room with unexpected weight. William did not respond right away. Instead, he looked down at the floor for a brief moment, as if the sentence had reached somewhere he had not prepared to revisit. In the background, the soft ticking of a wall clock filled the silence, marking time that felt slower than usual. "Stopped listening," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. Ava nodded slightly, not fully understanding what that meant, but sensing it mattered. William walked back toward the table and sat down again, this time closer than before. He placed his hands together, resting them lightly on the surface. "When I was younger," he began slowly, "I knew someone named Clara Johnson. We worked together on something that mattered a great deal, but life changed in ways that were not simple." He stopped briefly, then continued. "There were misunderstandings, and distance grew where there should not have been distance." Ava listened without interrupting, her attention fully focused on his voice. William exhaled softly, as if releasing something he had held for a long time. "I did not realize how much that separation continued to affect others," he said. The room remained still, the firelight shifting gently across the walls. After a moment, Ava spoke again, her voice careful but direct. "She still kept your name?" she said. William looked at her immediately. "Even after everything, she still said you mattered." That statement carried a quiet finality that neither of them commented on. William leaned back slightly in his chair, absorbing the weight of it. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, finally, he stood again and walked toward a side cabinet where a phone rested. He picked it up, but did not immediately dial. Instead, he stood still, looking at it, as if deciding whether the world beyond this room should be brought into what was unfolding inside it. Ava watched him from the table, sensing a shift, but not understanding its direction. After a few seconds, William set the phone back down and turned toward her. "Your mother is still at St. Mary's Hospital," he said. Ava nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." William gave a slight nod, as if confirming something internally. "Then we will go there," he said simply. Ava blinked, surprised but quiet. "Tonight?" she asked softly. William looked at her for a moment, then nodded once. "Yes," he said. "Tonight." The decision changed the air in the room again, not dramatically, but in a way that made everything feel more immediate. William walked toward the hallway and called for Edward Hayes once more. When Edward arrived, William gave him brief instructions, his tone now focused and precise. "Prepare the car." We are going to St. Mary's Hospital. Edward hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. Yes, sir. As Edward left to make arrangements, William returned to the dining area. Ava had stood up now, holding her small backpack again, as if preparing herself for movement. William looked at her and softened his voice slightly. You do not need to carry that anymore tonight, he said. Ava looked down at the bag but did not let go immediately. Then slowly, she placed it beside her chair. William nodded once in approval. Come, he said gently. Together, they walked through the long hallway of the mansion, past the Christmas tree still glowing softly in the corner, past the reflections of light and marble that seemed to stretch further than necessary. The house no longer felt like a place of distance, but like a space moving toward something unresolved. When they reached the entrance, the cold air from outside was already visible through the glass doors, waiting to meet them again. Ava paused for a brief second before stepping forward, and William opened the door, letting the winter night in once more. The drive through Manhattan felt longer than it should have, as if the city itself had slowed down around the weight of what was unfolding inside the black car. William Carter sat in the back seat, his posture straight but his expression distant, watching the passing lights reflect faintly across the tinted window. Ava Johnson was seated beside him, her small hands resting quietly in her lap, no longer gripping her backpack, but instead looking out at the city with a calmness that had not been there when she first arrived at his door. The heater in the car created a soft hum, blending with the sound of tires moving over wet pavement as snow continued to fall in uneven patterns across the streets. Edward Hayes drove in silence, occasionally glancing at the rearview mirror, aware that the atmosphere in the vehicle had changed from professional urgency to something more uncertain and personal. William broke the silence first. How far is St. Mary's Hospital from here? He asked calmly. Edward responded without turning fully. Approximately 15 minutes, sir, depending on traffic. William nodded once and leaned back slightly, his eyes shifting briefly toward Ava. She was still watching the passing city lights, her face reflecting faint patterns of gold and white as they moved across the glass. Are you tired? He asked her gently. Ava paused before answering. A little, she admitted, but I want to see my mom. William gave a slight nod, acknowledging her answer without adding unnecessary words. The rest of the drive continued in silence, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It felt like a pause before something important, as if the city itself was holding its breath. When the car finally arrived at St. Mary's Hospital, the exterior lights glowed softly against the falling snow, casting long reflections across the wet pavement. Edward parked near the entrance and immediately stepped out to open the door for them. William exited first, followed by Ava, who hesitated briefly before stepping onto the cold ground. The automatic doors of the hospital slid open with a soft mechanical sound, releasing a wave of warm air mixed with the sterile scent of antiseptic and quiet urgency. Inside, the waiting area was active but subdued, filled with distant footsteps, soft conversations, and the occasional sound of a monitor beeping from unseen rooms. William approached the reception desk with steady confidence, and within seconds, staff recognized his presence and shifted their attention accordingly. A nurse quickly approached. Mr. Carter, how can we assist you? She asked politely. William's voice remained calm but direct. I am here for a patient named Clara Johnson, he said. The nurse checked her records quickly, then nodded. She is currently in observation after emergency intake. She is stable, but resting. Ava stepped slightly closer to William when she heard that, her eyes fixed on the nurse as if waiting for permission to continue. William placed a gentle hand near her shoulder, not pressing, but guiding her presence forward. We need to see her, he said. The nurse hesitated briefly, then responded. Of course, please follow me. They were led through a long corridor lined with soft lighting and quiet rooms, the kind of place where time felt suspended. The sound of their footsteps was softened by the polished floor as they moved deeper into the hospital. Ava walked slightly ahead now, her pace quicker than before, as if something inside her was pulling her forward. William followed closely behind, his expression controlled but no longer distant. When they reached the room, the nurse paused and opened the door gently. The room was dimly lit, with a single lamp casting a warm glow over the bed where Clara Johnson lay resting. Medical monitors displayed steady readings, their soft lights blinking in calm rhythm. Ava stopped at the doorway for a brief second, her breath catching slightly as she saw her mother. Then she moved forward quickly but quietly, approaching the bedside. "Mom," she whispered. Clara stirred slightly, her eyes opening slowly as she recognized her daughter. A faint expression of relief crossed her face, fragile but real. William remained near the entrance of the room, watching in silence as Ava reached for her mother's hand. The scene was simple, but it carried a weight that filled the entire space. After a moment, Clara's eyes shifted slightly toward the doorway, and she noticed William standing there. For a brief second, there was recognition in her expression, followed by something more complex, something that had not been resolved over time. William stepped forward slowly, stopping a few feet from the bed. "Clara," he said quietly. Her voice was weak but steady when she responded. "You came." The words were not loud, but they carried more meaning than anything else spoken that night. Ava looked between them, sensing a connection she did not fully understand, but recognizing that it mattered deeply. William stood still for a moment, then lowered his gaze slightly before speaking again. "I should have come sooner," he said. Clara did not respond immediately, but her expression softened. The monitors continued their quiet rhythm in the background, marking time that now felt different than before. Ava remained by her mother's side, holding her hand firmly, while William stood just a short distance away, no longer separated by distance alone, but by years of silence that were finally beginning to break. The hospital room remained quiet except for the steady rhythm of the medical monitors, each soft beep marking a fragile sense of stability that contrasted with the emotional tension filling the space. Ava Johnson stood close to her mother's bedside, her small hand still wrapped around Clara Johnson's, as if afraid that letting go would make everything uncertain again. Clara's breathing was slow but steady, her eyes now more open than before, slowly adjusting to the presence of both her daughter and the man standing a few feet away. William Carter had not moved from where he stopped, but his silence no longer felt distant. It felt heavy, as if every memory he had avoided for years was now pressing gently but firmly against the present moment. Clara turned her head slightly toward him again, her voice soft but clearer than before. "I did not think you would actually come," she said. William's expression tightened slightly, not from discomfort, but from recognition of how much time had passed between then and now. "I should have," he replied quietly. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years that could not be undone by a single visit. Ava looked up at William, then back at her mother, sensing that the conversation between them was not just about the present situation, but something much larger that existed before she was even born. Clara slowly shifted her hand slightly, still holding Ava's, then spoke again, this time with more intention. "She looks like you did when you were younger," she said, her eyes remaining on William. The comment landed in the room like a quiet truth that had been waiting for permission to surface. William did not respond immediately. Instead, he lowered his gaze briefly, as if the words had reached a place he had not visited in a long time. Ava looked between them, confused but attentive, sensing that something unspoken was forming. William finally stepped closer, stopping beside the bed but maintaining a respectful distance. "Clara," he said gently, "there are things I was never able to explain properly." Clara nodded faintly, as if she had already understood that long before this moment. "I know," she replied softly. The simplicity of her answer seemed to carry years of unspoken distance between them. Ava remained still, her eyes moving slowly from her mother to William, trying to understand the invisible thread that connected the two adults in front of her. The hospital room felt smaller now, not physically, but emotionally, as if everything important had finally been brought into the same space. William placed his hands together loosely in front of him, his posture controlled but no longer detached. "When I left," he began carefully, "I believed it was the right decision at the time. There were expectations, responsibilities, and choices that I thought defined what my future needed to be." He paused briefly, then continued, "But I understand now that some decisions create distances that cannot simply be measured in time." Clara listened without interrupting, her expression calm but reflective. Ava shifted slightly closer to her mother, still holding her hand, but now also watching William with a different kind of curiosity. Clara spoke again, her voice steady but soft. I did not come here to reopen anything, she said. I came because there was no other place left to go. William nodded slowly, acknowledging the weight behind her words. And I did not expect to find you like this, he replied honestly. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the steady beeping of the monitors and the faint movement of distant footsteps outside the room. Then Clara turned her head slightly toward Ava. She insisted on finding you, she said gently, even when I told her it might not matter anymore. William's eyes shifted toward Ava, and for the first time, the distance between them seemed to narrow into something more personal. Ava lowered her gaze slightly, as if uncertain whether she had done something right or wrong. William stepped closer to her side, lowering himself slightly so that he was closer to her eye level. You did what you were told, he said softly, and you did it with courage. Ava looked up at him slowly, her expression softening just slightly at his words. Clara watched this exchange quietly, her eyes moving between them as if recognizing something that had not yet fully taken shape. After a long pause, William stood again and turned slightly toward Clara. I am not here to take anything away, he said. I am here because I believe I should have been here long before tonight. Clara did not respond immediately, but her expression shifted subtly, no longer guarded, but thoughtful. The tension in the room began to ease slightly, replaced by a quieter understanding that nothing in this moment could rewrite the past, but something in the present could still be acknowledged. Ava leaned gently against her mother's side, still holding her hand, now calmer than before. William looked at both of them for a moment longer, then spoke in a lower, steady voice. I do not know what comes next, he admitted, but I know I will not ignore this again. The room remained still after his words, not in uncertainty, but in the fragile calm that follows truth finally being spoken aloud. Outside the hospital window, the snowfall continued across the city, soft and unbroken, as if the world beyond the glass had also paused to listen. The hospital room felt different now, as if the air itself had softened after words that had been long overdue finally found a place to land. Ava Johnson remained close to her mother's side, her small fingers still interlaced with Clara Johnson's hand, while Clara rested more comfortably than before, her breathing steady and calm under the soft rhythm of the medical monitors. William Carter stood near the foot of the bed, no longer at a distance, but also not yet fully inside the circle that Ava and Clara shared. There was a quiet understanding in his posture now, a stillness that no longer came from detachment, but from reflection. The snowfall outside the hospital window continued, the city glowing faintly beneath a pale winter sky that made everything feel suspended in time. Clara broke the silence first, her voice gentle but certain. You do not need to stay here out of obligation, she said. William looked at her immediately, his expression steady. I am not here out of obligation, he replied calmly. I am here because I should have been here a long time ago. Ava looked up at him when she heard that, studying his face as if trying to understand the difference between those two ideas. Clara watched him for a moment, then slowly nodded, as if accepting something she had already understood in a different way for years. People do not always arrive when they are supposed to, she said quietly, but sometimes they still arrive when they are needed. The words settled into the room, not as judgment, but as acknowledgement. William stepped closer to the bedside again, his gaze shifting between Clara and Ava. What matters now, he said carefully, is what happens from this moment forward. Ava adjusted her position slightly, still holding her mother's hand, but now sitting more upright, her attention fully focused on the conversation. Clara turned her head slightly toward her daughter. Ava did not give up, she said softly, even when everything around her told her to stop trying. William looked at Ava directly now, and for a brief moment, his expression softened in a way that was almost imperceptible. You showed more persistence than most adults I have known, he said gently. Ava looked down briefly, not out of shame, but out of a quiet uncertainty about how to respond to praise she was not used to hearing. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, and the room remained calm, but something had clearly shifted in the dynamic between all three of them. William turned slightly toward the window again, his hands resting loosely at his sides. Clara, he said after a moment, I will make sure your treatment continues without interruption. Whatever is needed will be handled. Clara did not respond immediately, but her expression reflected quiet acceptance rather than surprise. I did not come here for promises, she said gently. I came here because I had no more choices left. William nodded once, acknowledging the truth of that statement without attempting to soften it. Ava leaned slightly closer to her mother, as if grounding herself in the presence of something stable after so much uncertainty. William then turned back toward both of them. Then let this be the point where choices begin again, he said. His voice was steady, but there was something different in it now, less controlled and more present. Ava looked up at him again, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her gaze, only quiet attention. Clara studied him for a moment longer, then spoke softly. You always spoke like everything could be measured and corrected, she said. But not everything works that way. William accepted the statement without resistance. I understand that now, he replied. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was balanced, as if something unresolved had finally been acknowledged without needing immediate resolution. Outside, the city continued under the snowfall, lights glowing through the winter haze, but inside the hospital room, the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be measured in numbers or decisions. Ava slowly leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, still holding her hand, her breathing now calm. William stood near the bed for a moment longer, then spoke quietly once more. I will return tomorrow, he said. Clara nodded faintly. We will be here, she replied. William looked at Ava one last time before turning toward the door. As he stepped into the hallway, the sound of the hospital behind him felt distant, but not disconnected. For the first time in a long time, he was not walking away from something unresolved, but towards something that had finally begun to take shape.